If you're looking for the perfect satin stitch on the Pfaff Creative Icon 2, there's a few things that you need to know. First, which stitch to use, which foot to use, and then one more bonus thing I'm going to show you is how you can actually do tapering with the Pfaff satin stitch. So first off, if you're in the utility stitches, a lot of people think of satin stitch as a manipulated zigzag. So here's what I want to show you about stitch number 6. If you go to Edit, Stitch, and begin to shorten it, you will realize that it will stop at 1.5 millimeters. And you can tell that it hasn't closed all the way up for the perfect satin stitch. A perfect satin stitch for me is when it's solid and as it stitches on the fabric, you can't see between the stitches, like it's a solid stitch. And so many people like skimp out. It's like just a zigzag that's really close together but not perfect, and then it just looks like a zigzag. So I want to show you how you get the perfect satin stitch. You start off by first jumping over to stitch number 12. Now I want to point out one more thing about stitch 12. A zigzag traditionally goes down and then back, and each time going down a certain distance, zigging and zagging. But with a satin stitch that is pre-programmed into the machine, notice that it goes across, then down, across, then down, giving you a more complete filled-in stitch. Next, when you go to Stitch Edit, I will tell you that the built-in or default setting for the stitch width for this is 6 millimeters wide. And honestly, that's a little wide for me. So traditionally, I am often reducing the stitch width. So when I'm satin stitching, I'm looking to cover usually a raw edge, or I'm giving something some extra definition. I usually don't need it 6 millimeters wide. Well, there's a time and place, but I usually like it somewhere in the 3 to 4 millimeter wide range. So as you reduce it down, you can find a width that is proportioned to the project you're working on. The next thing is the machine doesn't know which thickness of thread you're working with, so you then will adjust in small increments the length right here. Starting at 1 millimeter wide, as I touch it to a minus area, you're going to see this get more solid and more filled in. What you need to find is with a little testing on your fabric with a stabilizer, don't forget stabilizer, is when this stitch becomes nice and filled in but doesn't stop stitching. Like you shouldn't have to push the fabric through the machine to keep it from piling up. So that's kind of the happy medium that you're working with. If you're like me and using some of the thinner embroidery weight threads, I do usually adjust my stitch length down a little bit more. If you're using something more like a cotton or a traditional sewing thread thickness, you will probably find somewhere between the 0.8 and 1.0 stitch length will be more suited. Now, since I'm here, I want to show you one more thing, because right now you see the stitch is happening right down the center in the center needle position. And do you remember when we were talking about needle position, which is both in the width area, so if you toggle that over, now you can actually move that stitch to be to the, say, left side of your foot or the right side of the foot. So you can slide that left or right. The only time you can't slide it is, of course, when it is at the fullest size. So if it's a full 9 millimeter width, you won't have any wiggle room. The narrower it is, the more adjustment that you can use in sliding it left or right. So I do that quite often. Next, as we have the stitch selected, let's look at which foot is recommended. 2A plus stabilizer. So with your machine, pull out foot 2A, and notice, see that little cutout behind where the stitch is made? That's to allow for the thickness and density of the stitch you create to flow freely to the back. You also see that does not have a dual feed cutout, so make sure you disengage the dual feed, and you'll see that that is not engaged on any of these items of information. You want to have that not on. And you will also have an option if you've purchased the separate open toe foot with, that one does have the dual feed, by the way. There you go, open toe foot. You will have options for, say, seeing where you're going. So both these feet are my go-to feet for satin stitching. This is the one that comes with it, but if you really want to see where you're going, purchase the open or clear open toe foot with IDT system, and that will be awesome for you to use. I mentioned one more thing about tapering with a stitch like this. So there is a small little symbol that comes up on the screen right here where you will find a tapering menu. When you do this, you have the option to create a degree of tapering at the top of a stitch, and that it would be, say, 60 degrees or 30 degrees. You can pick both from changing it at both ends, only the beginning or only the end. So you can actually change the tapering. Now, to actually see it, do you notice this stitch is sitting behind this area? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch one of the tapering options, and then I'm going to minimize this screen so it will pull back into the center so you can see it. So you can see how, and I am going to make this a little wider just so it's a little easier to see, but see how it is tapered at the top. And it also will allow you to, if I open the tapering menu, I could taper the end a different degree altogether, however I want to stitch. Now the symbol of the reverse comes up. So when you're stitching a tapered option, your stitch will start with the taper and then it will stitch. So however long you want it to be, once you get it to the length you want it, and you want it to finish the taper, you touch the reverse button on the front of your machine that looks like this symbol, and that's what will finish the taper of your desired angle and then finish the stitch all together. So I do recommend, if you're doing any satin stitching, take some fabric, do some testing, adjust for first stitch length and get it so it tightens up based on the thread you're using. Next, stitch width, how wide do you want it to be? If you do want to play around with some of the tapering, you will find you have lots of options depending on what you are looking for the outcome. So satin stitching is a great way to do applique or add embellishments to any type of project. Sometimes I think of this as eyeliner. I'll go in and kind of give it a little definition by doing a very small, narrow satin stitch. Or if I'm wanting a much bolder look, you'll find all the stitch widths all the way up to the full 9 millimeters long. Check out our other videos on different kinds of applique, like blanket stitch applique, and seeing all the stitches that are built into this beautiful machine.